Greetings fellow gorehounds and welcome back to another Blood Splattered vlog. So this week's movie is once again a little different. Instead of talking about a typical horror movie, I am instead going to be talking about Netflix's new original movie, Fullmetal Alchemist, the Japanese language live-action adaptation of the shonen manga of the same name, which for those of you who don't know is an action-adventure story filled with a ton of existential and philosophical horror. So naturally, I was a pretty big fan of the original manga as well as the 2009 anime adaptation of it, but the 2003 adaptation I am less of a fan of, even though I really like the tone of that adaptation, because while the 2003 adaptation was extremely dark and handled all the existential and philosophical angst of the manga with way more dark weight than any of the other adaptations, it still ended up doing its own thing about halfway through. Which is funny because that 2003 adaptation was actually my introduction to Fullmetal Alchemist, and it just so happened that the point in which I lost interest in that anime was the point in which it stopped following the manga before I even knew there was a manga. And when I told my friend that I lost interest in the anime, he suggested that I read the manga, and then I started reading that, and then I became a fan ever since. And then they made the 2009 adaptation, which was almost a 100% fully faithful adaptation. There was a couple changes here and there, but overall it was pretty much one-to-one, and I loved that adaptation. Anyway, now that I got my weeaboo Fullmetal Alchemist history out of the way, let us talk about the new movie. And I gotta say, this is a movie that I had a lot of mixed feelings on. I didn't not like it, but it definitely felt like it was weighed down by the fact that it is a super condensed version of a really long story. And maybe if I hadn't read the manga or watched the two animes, I would have been a lot more forgiving of all the shortcomings of this movie. And maybe the movie wouldn't have felt as rushed as this movie ultimately does. But I can't really change the way I went into this movie, so it is what it is. That being said, let me talk about the things I liked about this movie first. Number one, a majority of the casting of this movie is actually pretty spot on. Ed and Al 100% feel like Ed and Al, and the CGI that goes into making Al looks beautiful. Like, you 100% believe that this giant suit of armor is walking around and has this little kid's voice, and you are actually feeling emotional feelings for this suit of armor. Now, a lot of the other CGI in the movie leaves a lot to be desired, but I was at least glad that the one thing they got right 100% was Al. Because if he didn't work, the entirety of the movie would not work. Winry feels like Winry, but for some reason they made her a brunette in this version instead of blonde, which feels really weird given how close they stick to everyone else's look. But that is like being super nitpicky, because that doesn't actually affect the emotional weight of the movie in any way. Colonel Hughes 100% feels like Colonel Hughes, but for some reason they made him a captain in this version. I don't know exactly why they made that change. That feels like a really arbitrary and unnecessary change, but they did. Roy Mustang definitely feels like Roy Mustang, though I do feel like at times they go a little bit too tough-lovey with him. And by that I mean he was always a surrogate father figure for Ed and Al in the manga and in the 2009 anime. And as a result of that, he always gave them a hard time because he wanted to see the best from them. But there are times in this movie where I felt like he came across as too much of a dick and not enough love. But that could have been just me, because ultimately he still felt like Roy Mustang despite that. Riza Hawkeye is in this movie, though you don't get to spend enough time with her to really gauge whether or not she's the same character. But to be fair, as far as this movie adapts from the manga, you really don't get a good gauge of who Riza Hawkeye is. So that's actually true to the manga. You really find out more about her way later on. Now, they make some big changes with Dr. Marco and Lieutenant Ross, but I'll talk about that when we get to the spoilers. Now, unfortunately, given the fact that this movie had to condense a whole lot of things, that also meant they cut out a lot of characters I really wanted to see. There is no Scar in this movie, there is no Armstrong in this movie, there is no Pride in this movie. And even in the storylines they adapt that included these characters, they are completely absent. Which I understand why. They needed to condense a whole lot, and they also needed to give the characters that are there more screen time. Like, for example, one of the things I do like is that Winry in this adaptation is way more there at the beginning than she is in the manga and in the animes. Which is pretty cool because I always liked that character and I always wanted to see her more on the front lines. But because of things like that, that does mean a lot of characters that I really did want to see ended up on the cutting room floor. Which is too bad, because Greed and Scar are two of my favorite characters in the entirety of Fullmetal Alchemist. And I sincerely hope, given the way this movie ends, they make more movies so that I can finally see them in their live-action versions. But that's not all I didn't like about this movie. There is a lot of small changes that were kind of necessary if they needed to shorten things. And some of these changes work really well, and you wouldn't know the difference if you didn't already know. But a lot of them ruin a lot of really key moments from Fullmetal Alchemist, and I'm hoping that the movies can recover from that. But I can't go more into detail about that until we get to the spoilers, because they are spoilers. And the other thing that doesn't work about this movie is something that's really hard to describe, but I'll do my best to. This movie has a lot of subpar CGI, and the subpar CGI in and of itself isn't the problem. But what is the problem is that they're using the subpar CGI in order to bring, like, one-to-one versions of actual comic panels from the manga to life. And I had this weird moment when the movie was bringing to life some of the more horrific scenes from the manga on the screen. And while a lot of the times it looked 100% like the manga or the anime adaptation, I was still sitting there going, this feels like something's not quite working and something's missing. Like, for a lot of these scenes, I needed something a little more raw and a little more practical in order to tangibly feel it on the screen. And I also needed the art department in this movie to take a few liberties with some of these scenes in order to make them more cinematically effective. Because scenes that in the manga and in the anime absolutely horrified me to my core, I'm sitting there watching them in this movie going like, yeah, that basically looks the same, but I feel really different watching it. Like, maybe if this thing over here was a puppet, or this thing over here was a little more Rob Bottin from The Thing, then maybe I would have felt it. But as it stands, it feels like something was missing, and the poor CGI is partially to blame, but so is the sticking too close to the material. Which I will admit is pretty hypocritical to say, because I'm going to be spending most of this vlog complaining about when it doesn't stick close to the material. But what can you do? Some things about this movie worked really well for me, and other things just kind of fell flat. Though I will say the actual alchemic fights that happen in this movie are brought to life pretty well. It's mainly when they had living, breathing creatures CG'd that it didn't work. And with that said, my fellow Gorehounds, I've run out of things to say before the spoilers, so I'm going to include some sort of Amazon affiliate link in the description below. And if you click that link in the description and buy something or rent something with that link, I will get a kickback from it. And with that, let us finally move on to the spoilers. Alrighty then, so this movie opens up with the classic scene from the manga and the anime in which Ed and Al's mother dies and then they try to bring her back to life with alchemy. And for the most part, this is pretty faithfully brought to life, except for when they actually end up opening the gateway to the truth. Because I always liked the way the 2009 adaptation did this, in which they are basically unraveled from their very existence. But instead for this movie, they do this weird Wicked Witch of the West thing where they're like transported into this tornado and they're flying on these rafts. And unfortunately, something about this visual and the overbearing music and the fact that the child actors in this movie weren't that good. Instead of feeling deep horror for these kids and pure existential dread, I was instead laughing my ass off. And right off the bat, I do not think that's the tone you want to strike for a Fullmetal Alchemist movie. Anyway, after this scene, they end up cutting to the present day, in which they're in the middle of the plotline in which Ed and Al are taking down that false priest. Which, if you recall from the manga and the anime, pretends that he can bring people back to life, but he can't. And it turns out the secret of his miracles wasn't God, but instead a fake Philosopher's Stone. But they don't really go too deep into this plotline. They basically have a fight with him, take him down until the villagers see he's a fraud. And then, oddly enough, Mustang shows up and arrests Ed and lets the priest go? Which I really don't understand why that happens, but okay. I mean, I know the reasonings they give me. The reasons they give me is because Ed was destroying a whole bunch of shit in order to fight this priest. But both Ed and Roy know that he could easily fix that with his alchemy, so what's the bother? In the anime and in the manga, Ed fights people in the streets all the time. He fights Scar in the streets. And afterwards, he just repairs all the damage. He doesn't get arrested for it. I don't know, I understand you needed to shorten things so that you could introduce Mustang really early, but this just didn't work for me, probably because I was so familiar with the anime and the manga. Now, the other thing that doesn't work for me about this fight scene is that during this fight scene, the priest ends up creating these rock monsters with his stone. Now, in the animes and in the manga, the priest does have monsters, but they're not rock monsters created from thin air, they're chimeras. And chimeras are created by combining two or more creatures into one creature. Because one of the things you learn at the beginning of Fullmetal Alchemist is that you can't create life. In fact, that's the whole rule that Ed and Al break that causes the entire plot to happen. So it just feels weird to me to have the priest at the very beginning of this movie create life right before our eyes. Now granted, they aren't human, but they are living, breathing creatures, and they do eat because they try to eat Ed. So what the fuck, that rule doesn't even make sense anymore. But anyway, after this scene, I start to like the movie a little more when they move on from the priest plotline to the plotline in which Ed and Al meet this one alchemist who has been dedicating his entire life to creating a talking chimera. And he barely succeeded 2 years beforehand, but he hasn't been able to have any progress with it since. And unfortunately, if he doesn't make progress with it, he's gonna lose his alchemist license. And for those of you who know Fullmetal Alchemist, you know exactly how this storyline is going to end because it is the most famous storyline in the entirety of Fullmetal Alchemists. Because this alchemist, in order to create a talking chimera, ends up fusing his daughter and his dog into one being, turning it into this tortured creature like the dogstrosity out of The Fly 2. Something that should probably be put down because its existence is just pure pain. And it's one of the few things that in this movie they pretty much do one-to-one. They don't change much. But for some reason in this movie, it just felt like it had diminished impact because when they do create the dogstrosity, it's this fully CGI'd creature, and while it looks one-to-one like its manga counterpart, it didn't feel real enough for me to feel it. Like, I feel like if it itself was done as a puppet, then definitely I would have felt that pain. But because I could clearly tell it wasn't actually there, it was created on the computer, it just felt like hollow. It reminded me of the feeling of watching the Star Wars prequels, and that's something you don't want to feel when watching a movie like this. That being said, the performances of that alchemist, Ed and Al, during this sequence and their eventual confrontation is really well done. If there is one thing I will say about the adult cast of this movie is that there's no one who gives a truly bad performance. But something I do want to say that I forgot to mention in the pre-spoiler section is I really do not like this movie's version of Envy. In the animes and in the manga, Envy is like this cackling maniac who takes great glee in his evil. And that always made him super fun to watch, especially as you watch the slow disintegration of that facade over time. Because obviously he's named Envy for a reason. It turns out he's actually super envious of all his victims, because they all had some sort of humanity that he did not. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but I'm trying to distill it to its rawest essence. But unfortunately, in this movie, Envy is just this scowling emo kid the entire time. Everyone else is brought to life beautifully, but for some reason Envy is given the total shaft. But I suppose that's neither here nor there, because he really plays a very small role in this movie. So maybe they didn't feel the need to actually give him all the love and attention that they give everyone else. But still, I love Envy. I would have loved to seen Envy done right. Anyway, while they're simultaneously doing the plotline with the alchemist, the daughter, and the dog, they smash together the plotline of Ed going to meet Dr. Marco, who, for those of you who don't know, in the anime and in the manga, Dr. Marco was the lead scientist for the military, and his main research was into the creation of this thing called the Philosopher's Stone. And Ed and Al are searching for the Philosopher's Stone. In fact, it's what their entire state alchemist license is based on, because they want to get a Philosopher's Stone in order to get Al's body back. Which, as this movie shows us in a flashback/nightmare sequence, Al lost when they tried to create their mom out of scratch, because alchemy works on the laws of equivalent exchange. If you want to create a life, you gotta give a life. So Al was whisked off into the afterlife, and then Ed, in order to save his brother, gave up his leg in order to put his brother's soul into a suit of armor. And because of all this, Edward loses his arm and his leg, which he then replaces with a metal arm and a metal leg created by his friend Winry, which, Jesus Christ, her name is really fucking hard to pronounce. Winry, god damn, it's like a tongue twister. But anyway, Winry creates him a metal arm and a metal leg that he uses, and that's why they are the Fullmetal Alchemists. Well, Edward is the Fullmetal Alchemist, Al is just his psychic. Even though Al is the one who's truly full metal, which is a joke that happens in the anime, the manga, and this movie. But anyway, they do something weird with the Dr. Marco plot in this movie, because in the anime and in the manga, Dr. Marco lives to about the very end of the story. A lot of terrible things happen to him, he ends up getting kidnapped and disfigured, but ultimately, he lives. But in this movie, Ed and Winry meet him, which is a whole nother change, because in the anime and in the manga, it's Armstrong who goes with Edward. But since Armstrong is not in this movie, I was glad they at least gave Winry a bigger role. Anyway, in this version of the story, Lust ends up appearing and killing Dr. Marco. But before Dr. Marco dies, he tells Edward that the secret to the Philosopher's Stone is in Lab Number 5. And Lab Number 5 was one of the big plot turns in the anime and in the manga, where they basically go to this secret lab that it turns out was run by the military, in which they used prisoners of war from the Ishvalan War, which is a whole nother thing. The Ishvalan War is basically regulated to this background information in this movie. But POWs from this war are used in experiments in this lab. And in the anime and in the manga, Edward finds out that the key to Philosopher's Stones is human lives pretty much when he meets Dr. Marco. But in this movie, it's regulated to the final act in which he goes to Lab Number 5 and finds out firsthand. Which, that's a change. I at least understand why they did it. They needed some big twist at the end in order to have emotional impact. But anyway, the next storyline from the manga they jump into is the storyline in which Hughes gets assassinated. And for the most part, the first part of this, up until the point he's about to be assassinated, is done pretty one-to-one. He finds out that there's a great secret within the military that's being covered up. Lust shows up and tries to kill him, but he fights her off. He runs off in order to call Mustang, but then he gets shot by Envy. But it's a little different in this version how the shot actually happens, because in both the anime and in the manga, when Envy first confronts Hughes, Envy is disguised as Lieutenant Ross. And the reason why this is important is because later on, Envy ends up framing the entire murder on Ross. In this version, he's disguised as Colonel Mustang. And in turn, Envy ends up framing Colonel Mustang for the murder of Hughes. And it's at this point in the movie where it feels like the movie goes completely off the rails and it starts just making up shit. Now, some of the shit it's making up, it's taking from pieces of things that happen in the manga, but they're stitched together in really strange ways that don't quite work. For example, in the anime and in the manga, Lieutenant Ross is framed and Mustang is the one that tracks her down, and everyone thinks out of revenge Mustang burns her alive. But it turns out he was actually on to lust and envy and knew that she didn't do it. So he creates this fake dummy, burns it, and then puts like actual replicas of her teeth in it, and then smuggles her out of the country so she's safe. In this movie, however, we have a similar confrontation in which Ross tracks Mustang down, and Mustang once again burns her, but she turns out to be Envy. And then they have the exchange that originally happened when Colonel Hughes was shot, where Hughes recognized that Ross was not Ross and in fact someone else, because Envy got the mole on her face on the wrong side of the face. Mustang reveals the reason why he burned Ross is because he recognized it wasn't actually Ross, it was Envy because of that same mole. And that was a change that somewhat worked, though it did feel weird. It was like a word-for-word exchange, but the wrong characters were saying it, and it just felt weird to me. I don't know how else to put it other than it felt weird. And this is also the part of the movie where everything starts to fall apart for me, because they start pulling things that happen way later in the manga and have them happen here. Like, for example, I don't want to spoil everything that happens at the end, but they do introduce the zombie army that happens at the very end of Fullmetal Alchemist. And they have that whole dialogue about the real reason why the military doesn't want people to create homunculi is because they don't want people to build an army. And while I like that they took that word for word from the manga, it did feel weird to have that happen here so early on in the Fullmetal Alchemist story. But it's pretty obvious the whole reason they do this is so that everyone else in the story has something else to fight at the end. Because really the Lab Number 5 storyline from the anime and the manga only included Ed and Al and Lieutenant Ross and her partner. Which again, her partner isn't even in this story. In fact, Lieutenant Ross doesn't feel like she's in this story because she's Envy the whole time. Oh yeah, and that alchemist who created the dog-girl hybrid, he turns out to be one of the main villains in this movie? In the anime and in the manga, he's killed by Scar, but in this version, he lives and basically comes back in the finale. And everything with him felt so shoehorned in and tacked on and just, oh god, I was rolling my eyes and waiting for it to end. This is a movie that probably should have been a miniseries, much like the Netflix Death Note movie. But needless to say, I do not recommend this movie to anyone who is a purist. You are not gonna like this movie. So I only recommend it to people that are okay with there being variations on the things they love. Like for example, if you're a fan of both the 2003 and the 2009 adaptation, you might be okay with this one too. But know going in, it's a mixed bag that is barely held together. And with that all said, my fellow Gorehounds, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and don't forget to ring that notification bell so that you're notified of my videos immediately upon their upload. And as always, peace out, and I'll catch y'all later.